In the run-up to the invasion of Normandy, the Allies used deception to deceive the Nazi high command as to where the invasion was going to occur. And while the deceptions of Operation Fortitude are relatively well known today, much less known is their predecessor, where many of those tactics and ideas were pioneered. Operation Bertram helped the British Eighth Army defeat Rommel's vaunted Afrika Korps. It's history that deserves to be remembered. By the outset of the Second World War, Italy controlled two major colonies in Africa, Italian Libya, which it had controlled since 1911, and Italian East Africa. Both would become battlefields in World War II, with the more important prize being Egypt, technically independent but under heavy British influence. It was vital for the British to protect the Suez Canal and the Red Sea, which represented the shortest route in connection to British India. The front, which historians call the Western Desert Campaign, was the primary ground-based campaign between the United Kingdom and the Axis during the early part of the war after the fall of France. The front was characterized by repeated changes in fortune, with each side making successful advances that would slow thanks to lengthening supply lines and shortages of personnel, which would then be dramatically reversed by the other side. On January 11, 1941, the first elements of the German Afrika Korps were dispatched to Libya under the command of Erwin Rommel, who quickly reversed early Allied gains and besieged Tobruk. The British Eighth Army halted the German advance at the First Battle of El Alamein in July 1942. Typical of the front, Rommel lacked enough troops to break Allied defenses and could expect no reinforcements until the Soviet Union was defeated. Rommel was forced to dig in and hoped to defeat an Allied counterattack. Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery took command of the Eighth Army in mid-August. Montgomery's planning included an elaborate ruse to confuse the Germans about the timing and location of the coming attack in an effort dubbed Operation Bertram. The idea of deceiving the enemy through subterfuge is not a new one. Machiavelli in The Art of War wrote that a man who uses deception to overcome his enemy is to be praised, and Sun Tzu wrote that all warfare is based on deception. In Homer's Aeneid, the Greeks fool the Trojans with the Trojan horse, while in Macbeth, Malcolm's army disguised itself as trees. In 1513, French defenders at Tournai put up canvas painted like fortifications to deter English forces. The modern battlefield of the 20th century provided its own challenges. Machine guns could kill at stupefying rates, and planes allowed aerial reconnaissance to become vital for planning and intelligence. Uniforms became drab in an attempt to hide soldiers, and camouflaging movements and material became commonplace. World War I saw the introduction of mass camouflaging and the invention of the camouflage net. World War II made the need for camouflage even more apparent. The destruction of Guernica by the Luftwaffe during the Spanish Civil War in 1937 made it clear just how devastating air bombing could be, and committees in England formed to find ways to shelter or hide civilian and important military targets. In 1938, the British Camouflage Advisory Committee began disguising aerodromes, factories, and runways in preparation for possible war. From the beginning, camouflage was prioritized, and Fred Beddington was enlisted by the Royal Engineers to train a camouflage unit, even before Germany had invaded France. Besides learning the principles of camouflage, the men trained in camouflage courses were told to spread the gospel of camouflage, impressing the idea that every soldier was responsible for hiding their own position and actions. Geoffrey Barkas was among the first men trained. He was not an artist like many of the so-called camoufleurs, but a veteran of the First World War, a writer and a film director in the interwar years. Tasked with teaching the importance of camouflage, he wrote the poem The Sad Story of George Nathaniel Glover. Driver George Nathaniel Glover, despite the use of natural cover, and never could be made to park his lorry in the shade. Glover, Barkas wrote, believed that an ungarnished camouflage net made his lorry basically invisible. When German planes arrived in herds and landed several tons of muck right on top of George's truck, emerging later safe and sound, his comrades searched for miles around, but not one trace did they discover of driver George Nathaniel Glover. Barkas published the poem in a pamphlet that spread across the British military. Barkas was chosen to command a camouflage unit in Egypt and sailed there the long way around Cape Horn to arrive in January of 1941. He and his small team, which would grow greatly in the coming months, studied the desert from the air, examining what seemed to be featureless beige for new patterns, which they named among them the wadi pattern, the polka dot, and the figured velvet. The Middle East Camouflage Directorate under Barkas tested new concepts, such as General Wavel's suggestion of a lorry frame that could be fit over a tank, dubbed the sun shield. Sun shields were effective at disguising tanks and cheap to produce. Other techniques the directive pioneered were shadow houses, in which a kind of counter-shading was used to make air bases look like civilian housing. The technique was so effective that even Allied pilots were sometimes fooled. One refused to land, insisting there was no safe place. When Tobruk was besieged, several trapped camoufleurs went to work, scrounging up the detritus to assist in the defense, using a disgusting paste made of rancid Worcestershire sauce and flour to dull shiny helmets and windshields. Among their most successful projects was a large netting screen, which hid a unit of tanks with 42,000 yards of Hessian garnish. The disguise kept the Germans from accurately targeting the British units. At least 2 aircraft were shot down attempting to destroy the screen. Camoufleurs also used nets attached to sunken ships to hide vital lightships in the Tobruk harbor, as well as the gunboat HMS Nat. The Navy thanked the camoufleurs, calling their work particularly successful. They also hid the British airstrip and 3 Hawker Hurricanes. One was hidden in a hurricane-shaped hole with a camouflage lid that could be set on top. The Germans repeatedly attacked the fake airbase and marked it as real on a captured reconnaissance photo. One colonel complained that a dummy anti-aircraft battery fooled the Germans too well and was drawing too much enemy fire. Most dramatically, the camoufleurs protected the city's irreplaceable desalination plant. The plant was painted and decorated to look like it had taken a direct hit. They prepared the supplies and then, immediately following a night bombing raid, set the whole scene. The ruse worked, and newspapers reported that the plant had taken a direct hit. A German report from the battle read, "The Australian is unquestionably the superior of the German soldier in the use of ground camouflage." Tobruk had proved beyond a doubt the utility of good camouflage. During Operation Crusader in November and in December of 1941, an entire dummy railhead was constructed, which successfully pulled pressure off the real railhead. They built a fake high-priority port in an operation dubbed Belsea between Benghazi and Tobruk, which was unfinished when fortunes changed again and Rommel marched back across Libya, again pushing the Allies into Egypt. By July, Rommel had gone as far as he could go to capture Cairo and the Suez Canal, and was forced to dig in as his supplies ran out outside of El Alamein. Rommel lacked the supplies and meant to attack again, while the Eighth Army was disorganized and terrified of Rommel's reputation. In an effort to save Egypt from falling, Barkas in the camouflage unit was given operational priority for Operation Sentinel. The goal of Sentinel was for dummy tanks and military equipment to give the illusion that the Allied line was much more formidable than it actually was. Dudley Clark, a British deception agent, not affiliated with the camouflage unit, invented and led out the story that the British planned to lure Rommel into minefields and into much better defenses further in the rear. Barkas's unit reinforced real gun positions with fake ones and created a phantom light armored brigade to fill a very real hole in the line. Within 3 weeks, the camoufleurs had created 2 phantom divisions that seemed to be held in close reserve, to help buy vital time for actual reinforcements to fill those positions. On August 12th, General Bernard Law Montgomery arrived in Cairo to take command of the Eighth Army. The camouflage unit's greatest achievement was to come under Montgomery in what would become the final assault of the Western Desert Campaign. In October of 1942, the opposing lines had solidified, each defended by miles of minefields and static defenses. The actual line of battle was short, roughly 30 miles from the coast of the Mediterranean, south to the border of the Qattara Depression, which was effectively impassable to tracked and wheeled vehicles. Montgomery's plan was for 2 attacks, a main attack in the north and a secondary feint attack in the south. In the north, he needed to clear paths in the minefields for armored units to break through. The Germans would have time to prepare defenses. It was General Dudley Clark and his secretive A-Force who conceived of Operation Bertram, an elaborate ruse meant to fool and confuse the Germans about when and where the attack would take place. Uncertainty about where the attack would take place forced Rommel to split his armored formations into 2 groups to defend the northern and southern parts of the line. Barkas and the camoufleurs were asked to hide the movement of hundreds of tanks and field guns, along with all of their supporting equipment, while convincing the Germans that the main attack would be in the south. They had just over a month before the attack would commence. In support, Clark also planned Operation Treatment, meant to deceive the Germans into thinking the Allies planned to invade Crete, and Operation Canwell, 25 radio transmitters meant to simulate the radio traffic of a corps, 2 divisions, and 5 brigades. Barkas and his team thought that they could do it by using their dummy tanks and the sun shields, meant to make tanks look more like trucks, to simulate 2 armored brigade groups, complete with supporting vehicles and infantry. To convince the Germans that the attack would come later than it actually would, they planned to build a pipeline heading south, and to time it so that it seemed that it couldn't be finished for at least several days after the actual attack was scheduled. Monty thought that wasn't good enough and demanded 2 more phantom armored brigades to make up an entire armored corps. Barkas called it the biggest film production on which I ever expect to be engaged. First, Barkas sent more than 700 trucks north, where they would park in the desert in the same spot that would become the buildup area for tanks in the coming attack. The harmless trucks could slowly be replaced with tanks wearing sun shields, with the German observers none the wiser. In the south, he created dummy stores of ammunition, oil, gas, food, and water, and started building a pipeline directly towards the Phantom supply dump. The pipeline was actually made out of rusted 4-gallon gas cans hammered into a pipe shape. 5 miles of the dummy pipe were made, and each day 5 miles of trench were dug with the pipes laying beside them. At night, they filled in the trench and moved the pipes up to the next 5 miles. Fake water towers, control boxes, and more were built to follow the path, and vehicles were driven around to simulate activity. Its progress was carefully calculated to give the impression that it would be finished days after the actual attack began. Well, Barkas had enough sun shields to hide the tanks. Making fake tanks was a different problem. One of the camoufleurs came up with a brilliant idea. Thousands of Egyptian workers made bed frame and packing cases using reeds and a few simple patterns, and camoufleur John Baker built a dummy tank using the already ubiquitous patterns. Field guns and the identifiable quad tractors were disguised with a fake truck canopy that used the real wheels of the guns and quads to mimic a 3-ton truck. The camouflage was called cannibals because the guns and limbers were eaten up by the canopy. Thousands of gallons of fuel were hidden in the north in unused trenches, invisible from the air. Food and ammunition was stored in the hundreds of trucks, covered with tarps that made them look like more trucks. As the tanks were moved in to replace the trucks, dummy tanks were built behind them, making it look like no tanks had been moved at all. It took 2 full nights to move the tanks into position. Montgomery's attack began on October 23rd in the evening, preceded by a vicious bombardment that used more than 500,000 shells. Engineers, using the newly invented minesweepers, set out in the night to clear paths for the tanks. The Second Battle of El Alamein had begun. After 13 days of fighting, on November 4th, the German lines were broken, and Rommel ordered a retreat. It was the beginning of the end for the Panzer Army Afrika. The success of Bertram can be measured in a number of ways. When news reached England, Churchill reported that victory had come thanks to a marvelous system of camouflage, which allowed complete tactical surprise. General Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma, captured during the assault, told Montgomery that he thought the Allies had at least one more armored division than they did, and that the German command thought the attack would come in the south thanks to the false buildup. General George Stumm, who took over command when Rommel briefly returned to Germany, thought the attack wouldn't come for several weeks. And most tellingly, captured documents implied that the Axis leaders were fooled completely. An Italian map placed the 10th Corps armored divisions in the south. The German intelligence summary predicted a main attack in the south and a feint in the north. By all appearances, the Afrika Korps had been outwitted. The Ghost Army of Operation Bertram was among the largest physical deception campaigns of the Second World War. They used hundreds of dummy tanks and trucks and nets and anti-aircraft emplacements and more. And the success of Operation Bertram helped to inspire and inform the efforts to disguise Operation Overlord, where Operation Fortitude created entire Ghost Army groups in the south of England to convince the German High Command that the attack was coming at the Pas-de-Calais, and in the north of England to convince them that there was an attack coming on Norway, and those deception campaigns are credited with saving thousands of Allied soldiers' lives. Operation Bertram itself helped to defeat Rommel and end the Western Desert Campaign and secure the vital Suez Canal for the Allies. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.